Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to another session of the Botany Bistro. Coming at you from Cincinnati, Ohio. We are based out of the Civic Garden Center, which is an organization that has been here for 80 years, teaching people in the region and beyond about sustainable gardening, conservation, and urban agriculture. My name is Mary Dudley, and I am the Ecology Education Manager here at the Civic Garden Center. And I am presenting to you the 11th episode of the Botany Bistro. It's been such a fun series so far. I can't wait to keep going. And today's episode is packed with lots of fun things. We are just going to review for a minute what Botany Bistro is. And the concept for this series is bite-sized botany that you can use in your home garden, in your kitchen, and in your social life so that you can use some of the botanical principles and foundations that have helped me so much in my career. And I share that with you today. Some of the things that we have talked about in other sessions include basic botany, plant anatomy, plant morphology, systematics and taxonomy, and 2 weeks ago, we did our first part of plant physiology. So we're going to be digging into physiology again this week. Please keep tuning in with us or catching up on YouTube after the class. I think that today's session is going to be really fun and packed with lots of useful information for you. We do have homework every week. And so if you want to take this knowledge a little bit further, you can post your favorite lenticule, vocabulary word, on our social media and tag us at Civic Garden on Facebook. So if you want to make sure that you have the next date on your calendar, we will be doing another live Google Meet on November 3rd at noon. And that session is going to start to kick off our plant pathology series, which is going to be focused on pathogens and diseases for plants. Botany is just such a huge field, and so it's really nice to be able to break it up into different sections and chew on it in bite-sized pieces. So I'm really glad that you're here at the Bistro today. Now it is lunchtime, and so we always want to know what's for lunch. Today for lunch, my lunch is pretty chill. One of those mom days where you run out of the house and you're like, I need something. But it's still great to have a nice healthy snack. And I was a formal educator for several years, so I feel like an apple is very appropriate for my snack today. I will need to have a little bit more sustenance than this, but our apple is going to be the key component of some of the topics we'll cover today in our plant physiology part 2. So we'll enjoy some little apple snacks. I hope you're all enjoying your own nutritious foods that you have chosen. I hope you're having some healthy snacks while we enjoy our time together today. Now, I know that some of you might be watching this for the first time, and so if that is the case, then just know that I strive to create an environment where you're able to listen. I don't rely heavily on visuals, and so if you want to take the show on the road and listen to it while you're on a walk or doing other errands, definitely feel free to do that. You won't be missing out on anything. All right. So for our lesson today, we're going to review a little bit of what we talked about last time, which was heavily focused on photosynthesis. So we'll just do a little recap on that. And then we're going to dive into respiration and transpiration, which are also major physiological processes that happen within plants. So let's recap on photosynthesis. And so photosynthesis means to put together with light. It is the way that plants are able to create their own foods, their own carbohydrates, with light energy. And so the formula for photosynthesis is carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight equals sugar plus oxygen. So it's very simplified. If you want to go back and review one of our past sessions, you can get some more of that info. But we need to remember that plants, in order to live their best lives, are needing to have access to sun, carbon dioxide, and water in order for photosynthesis to happen. Chlorophyll is the pigment that makes leaves green, and as you can see behind me, the red bud is starting to lose some of that chlorophyll, some of that's dying out, and so we're able to see some of the other pigments in those leaves. In just a few weeks, probably most of those leaves will fall off, so you'll get to see the changing of the seasons along with the series. And now those chlorophylls are found in chloroplasts, and they trap the light energy from the sun that is used for photosynthesis. If any of these ingredients, carbon dioxide, light, or water, are lacking, photosynthesis can slow or stop. And if any of those factors is absent for too long, then a plant can die if it's not able to create its own food sources. So we don't really need to worry so much about carbon dioxide if our plants are outside. It's plentiful in the air. We're making sure that we have good ventilation if we have indoor plants so that they have carbon dioxide access. But I was looking up some interesting ideas on if you have a tightly sealed greenhouse space. There are carbon dioxide generators that are used in commercial greenhouses for crops such as roses, carnations, and tomatoes. And if you have a smaller home greenhouse, you could put out some dry ice as a source of carbon dioxide. So I know Halloween's coming up, and you never know if your houseplants want to have a little spooky party. You could put on the fogger and the dry ice machine, and you kind of let them have their little carbon dioxide party. I thought that was interesting. So that's our recap on photosynthesis. Let's talk a little bit about respiration. So all living things respire, all cells respire. And so the carbohydrates that are made during photosynthesis need to be converted into energy, and this energy is used for cell growth and building tissues. The chemical process by which sugars and starches are converted into energy is called oxidation. It's similar to burning of wood or coal, and controlled oxidation in a living cell is called respiration. Now, if we want to compare photosynthesis and respiration, we can simplify it to say photosynthesis is a building process while respiration is a breaking down process. And like I said, it happens in all life forms and all cells. So looking at a table of the differences and the different ways that gases are used in these processes, photosynthesis produces food, respiration uses food. Photosynthesis stores energy while respiration releases this energy. Photosynthesis requires water, and respiration has water as a byproduct. Now, this is important to remember these things next. Photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide, like we mentioned, whereas respiration produces carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis releases oxygen as a byproduct, and respiration uses oxygen. So we love our plants because they absorb carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. But there are processes that happen within plants that use oxygen and release carbon dioxide, and that is respiration. Also, photosynthesis is light dependent, and respiration is not, so it occurs all the time in the dark as well as the light. So we're really getting into kind of the secret life of plants here on the Bistro today. So we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about respiration, but I did mention transpiration as another important physiological process, and I wanted to make sure that we included that before we move on. So transpiration happens when water is lost from a plant. And so typically this is going to be happening out of the stomata, which are those cells on the bottom of the leaf in most plants that can open and close, so they can regulate when they are losing water moisture, when they're transpiring. And so when the guard cells around these stomata shrink, the stomata open and water is lost. Also, more water is pulled up through the roots, so it creates this kind of pressure system, and all these water molecules are moving from the roots all the way up to the leaves. And so that's happening in the xylem cells that we talked a little bit about in a previous series, previous sessions. And so it's important that the plant has enough water moving through it to move lots of different sugars around and provide all the necessary equipment and needs for the processes that need to happen within the plant. But about 90% of the water that plants soak up is actually transpired out. And about 10% or less in some plants is used for some of these other processes. The rate of transpiration is directly related to whether the stomata are open or closed. And so transpiration is responsible for transporting minerals from the soil through the plant, cooling the plant through that evapotranspiration that's happening, moving sugars and chemicals, and maintaining turgor pressure. Turgor pressure is making sure that the plant stays rigid and can stay up. And so when you see a plant wilting, like my peace lily, its turgor pressure is being lost because it does not have enough water. And so that's a good sign to me to give it a little bit of water. And so transpiration is greatest in hot and dry environments. Windy weather can also affect transpiration rates. There are different plants that have developed processes to be able to keep their stomata closed during hotter times and open during cooler times. So that's very important for plants. But thinking about the amount of water that is lost through transpiration or, just released through transpiration, a corn plant can transpire 50 gallons of water per season. And a large tree could move 100 gallons of water a day. Now, there are some that do much more than that. And so I wanted to think a little bit about what happens if plants are losing too much water. They'll close those stomata, but the stomata being closed also prohibits the exchange of gas. And so we need carbon dioxide and oxygen for these different processes that are happening, photosynthesis and respiration respectively. And so closing the stomata also limits the amount of gas exchange. So it really is a balancing act for these plants to be like, should I close? Should I stay open? And so hopefully those plants are growing under ideal conditions when they're in our care and are able to make that balance happen. So transpiration is an important part of the water cycle, along with precipitation, condensation, and evaporation. So I'm sure all these words are getting your mind going. You're like, I remember the water cycle, yeah. And when we were younger, I think that my teacher at least kind of glossed over transpiration. We didn't really cover it much because it was, he had to dig a little deeper to get that information. And so I'm glad that we can revisit it now. So one of the ways that we can apply this knowledge is thinking about where transpiration is happening the most. And so we have these beautiful rainforests around our globe. And they're areas where plants can thrive throughout the seasons. They don't have to deal with some of the challenges of cold weather. They typically are growing in kind of shallow soil, so that can be a limiting factor. There's lots of competition for light, but the biodiversity in our rainforest areas is very high. So we want to make sure that we're saving those areas. On a typical day, the trees in the Amazon release 20 billion tons of moisture into the atmosphere. 20 billion tons of moisture. Seeding clouds with rain. The clouds move westward across the Amazon, and the moisture is recycled from sky to land 5 to 6 times as it moves. And so the rainforest, literal, like it's raining in the forest, that rain is coming from the plants themselves. And so the rain hasn't always been there. It won't always be raining in the rainforest without the plants. And so studies have found that the moisture cycle in the Amazon actually regulates rainfall patterns as far as the Midwest in the United States, where we all are today. Deforestation can disrupt the water cycle significantly, and it decreases the precipitation because it doesn't have the transpiration, right? It's all kind of chicken egg situation, which can lead to changes in river flow and water volume. Some estimates have said that the Amazon rainforest needs to be at least 80% intact in order to keep these cycles healthy and sustainable. we have about 81% of our forests intact right now. So we are walking a really fine line. And on days when we might not think that what's happening in the Amazon really pertains to us, it does. And so we need to make sure that we are doing what we can to support those communities and their practices. So thinking about that, rainforest is reliant on plants and they come together. It also has predicted that if we lose significant plant cover in those areas, that area could turn into grassland or even desert without the transpiration that's happening. All right, so that was a little bit about transpiration, but I want to go back to respiration because there's some cool stuff there that we have not uncovered yet. And so let's think about roots. We've talked a little bit about leaves and how that is working. Roots do need oxygen to live, to have their processes happening. And so they find this oxygen in the spaces in the pores of the soil. So you need well-structured soil that has airspace in it so that they can have access to oxygen. And so it enters the roots via the fine hairs that cover their tips. Plants will grow poorly in soils that do not have enough airspace. These are soils that are compacted, waterlogged, or say you have a pot that is crowded with roots. There's nowhere for the roots to get access to oxygen. I do not do gardening outdoors when it is wet. Because you're compacting that soil and you're kind of squishing out those pores that the oxygen needs to go into for the plants. And so if you're ever like, oh, I really need to mow my lawn, but it rained and I don't want to compact the soil, that's a great excuse. You can keep that all day long. Now, waterlogged soil are areas where the air spaces are filled with water, so there's not enough oxygen to diffuse into the roots, which can suffocate them and hinder growth. But these soil microorganisms that grow in anaerobic conditions without access to oxygen produce damaging toxins, and the buildup of these toxins can result in an unpleasant kind of eggy smell that we associate with that soggy soil, stagnant soil. So make sure that your plants have enough aeration in their soil that they're able to access oxygen as they need to in their roots, and that they're not too waterlogged or compacted. Now, I know what you're saying. You're like, Mary, I have cuttings that I'm propagating on my windowsill, and they're in only water. So you're wrong, and you're telling me that I'm wrong. I hear you. So let's talk a little bit about that. Cuttings can live in water for some time without any roots, just by sucking up that water through their xylem and spreading it around the plant, as long as they have some leaves that can still access sunlight for photosynthesis. But most plants will produce some roots when they have been in water for a while, if they are able to be propagated in that way. Now, these roots are called water roots, and they can get their oxygen from the dissolved oxygen in the water. So you want to make sure that that water is being changed regularly or is oxygenated in some way. Water roots are different from what we call soil roots because they're specialized for living in water, and they would not rot away in that case. They're really light in color, kind of almost white, and they're usually thin, more fragile, long. They grow fairly quickly in some cases and have little offshoots that kind of give them a little bit of a hairy appearance. And so they are not as sturdy maybe as our soil roots would be, because they don't have the resistance of growing through the soil, and they don't have to search as far and wide for their resources. Everything's being given to them in that beautiful little jar or hydroponic setup, what have you. And so we have plants that can grow soil roots after being propagated in water, as they have developed water roots. They can also develop soil roots. They tend to be a little bit darker in color, are a little bit harder to break, and they're designed to dig deep. All right, so I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. I am wrong sometimes, but most plants that are growing in soil need to have airspace so that they can access oxygen. And you just want that anyway. You don't want your plants sitting in water for a really long time. So you want to have good drainage in your outdoor garden. You can do aeration, you can mix in compost. There's some things you can do there. And then making sure that your house plants and potted plants are being cared after. Every little while you're kind of repotting those, or maybe replacing some soil, or refreshing that water. All right. So let's think about digging deeper into respiration and how that happens. I mentioned the stomata and how the guard cells will open and close that stomata in order to reduce water loss or facilitate gas exchange. And so that's all well and good on leaves that have living cells in contact with the air. But what about bark? So what about our woody parts of plants? And those are typically impervious. And so to get oxygen to the active tissues underneath bark, it's perforated by pores called lenticels. So this is your homework. What's your favorite lenticel? And so lenticels are sometimes decorative. You can see them in the bark of birches, glossy trunks of cherries. Lenticels are visible on fruit surfaces such as my apple. I can see those little white dots on there. Those are lenticels. And in juxtaposition to stomata, which are able to open and close, lenticels are always open. And so they are facilitating that gas exchange. So there's something actually happening right here with my apple. And so other fruits like mangoes and avocados also have lenticels. And so in an apple fruit, lenticels account for up to 21% of the transpiration that happens. So that's how it's able to still continue to respire and do the work that it needs to do. And here's an interesting factoid when I was looking up lenticels. If any of you are wine drinkers and you are curious about your cork, which as a botanist, I guess that just is something that I'm into. I look at the cork, and sometimes the corks are plastic, sometimes they are composite, which is like little bits of cork that have been chopped up and then glued back together. But I'm talking about like real deal cork from the actual oak tree that is harvested. And you can see that the lenticels are kind of running crosswise on those corks. They look like little scratches almost in the cork. And so higher quality corks have narrower and less lenticels than lower quality corks. Because those lenticels would need to be blocked to keep wine from spoiling. And so sometimes those corks are glued or coated in order to block some of those lenticels. So it's interesting. I do love a budget glass of wine. I'm not, trying to be elitist in any way. So I'm like, oh yeah, I'll take all of it. But it's really interesting that price reflects, maybe the cost of the cork. Maybe they cut down on that cost of the bottle by having a cork that they were adapting in a different way to make sure that those lenticels weren't open and that the wine was not exposed to too much air over time. And so I thought that was interesting. Also take a look at your champagne cork closely next time you are celebrating something. Typically champagne corks are going to have composite on top and then layers of real cork, glue or full cork glued to the bottom. And they kind of turn them in different orientations so that there's no one direct way for air to escape, because we want all those wonderful bubbles in our champagne. You can also count the rings on your cork because they are bark. And just like we talked about with trees, you can actually see how old your cork is. Pretty neat. All right, so here's a little story for you. Moving on from cork. And we're going to talk about a process it's involved with respiration, but it's a physiological process that fruits go through, harvested food goes through. And so this is very pertinent to our bistro today. Let's listen to this story, this little scenario for a minute. All right, so on Take Your Child to Work Day, little Patty put her snack of an apple into the cooler with the cut flowers when her mom was in the back making sure that she had everything she needed for the wedding bouquet she was putting together for the day. Little Patty was very proud of herself. She's like, oh yes, I'm refrigerating my apple just like mommy would want me to. But she was caught off guard when her mother came back from getting her orders together and quickly yanked the fruit out of the cooler and told her that those flowers do not want to share their space with her apple. Why did this happen? Little Patty needs to know. And so let's talk about ethylene. So ethylene is a colorless gas that's naturally produced by plants and functions as a growth regulator. Ethylene triggers specific events during a plant's natural growth and development, such as ripening. And through this action, it induces changes in some of the plant's organs. Firmness of the fruit flesh usually softens, the sugar content rises, and the acid levels are reduced. Also, those wonderful smells are released, and the true flavor of the fruit develops. This is all important for yummy fruits, and ethylene is the catalyst for it. The color of the fruit can darken, and then the green color tends to fade. So you know when your things are changing to those really nice bright peppers, the apples that are changing, that'll be because the ethylene production has kicked up. Now, why didn't the flowers want to be next to the apple? All right, so the apple is one of these fruits that's called climacteric species. And these species produce ethylene as they ripen, and the harvested produce is capable of ripening post-harvest. So these are some of those fruits that you can harvest when they're not quite ripe yet. You can put them on the shelf, you can put them on the counter, you can put them in a bag, and they will continue to ripen. Climacteric species. Bananas, apples, peaches are examples of those. Also, avocados, tomatoes, blackberries, kiwis, apricots, plums, things like that. So that's climacteric. Non-climacteric plants, such as leafy vegetables, do not continue to ripen after the harvest. And so if you think about flowers, the flower is the precursor to the fruit. And so if you're thinking about ripening and making sure your fruit is mature, it makes sense that the ethylene production would trigger the dropping of those petals and the drooping of that. Oh, I don't need to pay attention to this flower anymore. I need to focus on my fruit. And so if you're storing fruits near flowers, those flowers are being exposed to that off-gassing of ethylene and can make it very difficult for them. And so we've got a nice kitchen counter that I like to put things on, but I do not put my cut flowers, my vase of cut flowers, near my fruit bowl because I don't want that ethylene to impact the longevity of my cut flowers. That's your another little tip for the day. So how are you going to use all this botanical knowledge that I just dropped on you? I decided to sum it up today because there was quite a bit. So let's just review some of those useful tips. So we want to make sure we're ensuring proper ventilation for our plants. If you have a tightly sealed space, you want to get a little dry ice and have that little spooky Halloween party for your plants. That would be a boost so that they are able to respire appropriately and photosynthesize appropriately. You also want to protect our rainforest areas because they impact our global hydrological cycle through transpiration. So making sure that we are doing everything that we can to hold on to our trees. We want to pay attention to our soil structure for space to have oxygen flow by adding compost, aerating, ensuring that our containers have drainage holes, and repotting plants into larger pots as they fill all of that space in their pot with their roots. We also want to look out for cool lenticels on trees and fruits. So definitely take a look at an apple next time you see one and be like, oh, I know what all those dots are doing now. They are exchanging gas and releasing ethylene. Be the oddball at your next party and study the cork to see if you can count the rings and survey those lentils as well. And you can say, oh, this is a very high quality cork. Set your crisper drawer on high humidity to protect ethylene-sensitive vegetables such as cucumbers, herbs, and leafy greens. When it's set to high humidity, actually that air exchange is cut off from the drawer, and so it's important to be able to isolate those veggies. You can also set your climacteric fruits on low humidity so that ethylene can be released. And make sure that anything that's starting to be overripe or starting to rot is removed, because that overproduction of ethylene and the other things that are happening as that decomposition process happens will affect the other foods that you have next to it. And don't put your flowers next to your fruit bowl so that you can extend the life of your beautiful cut flowers. All right, that was our bistro today. I'm going to turn on the chat, and I just want to thank all of you for your time. Don't forget to join us on November 3rd at noon to learn a bit about plant pathology.